Hello, friends. Thanks for joining another episode of the Westminster Standard podcast. This will be the final installment of our PCA General Assembly prep. I hope it's useful to you. We're joined by Dr. Michael Lynch and Teaching Elder James Baird to discuss some of the changes that the Americans made to the Westminster Standards in 1788. Just a note on the programming here. This episode was recorded before some of the recent articles by Dr. Kevin DeYoung. So they're not responding to anything that he has written, and we would commend those articles to you and to take them into consideration as well as the arguments made here. Also, for those of you who are going to be in the Chattanooga area on June 22nd, the Sunday before General Assembly, I want to invite you one more time to come and worship with us at First Presbyterian Church in Fort Oglethorpe. Dr. O. Palmer Robertson, PCA founding father, will be preaching from Galatians chapter 6, verses 11 to 18, 3 kings and 3 crosses. And then Dr. Ligon Duncan will be preaching at 6 o'clock for evening worship from Psalm 121. The Lord is your keeper. I hope we'll be able to worship with a number of you morning and evening. And otherwise, we will look forward to seeing you in Chattanooga for the General Assembly. Westminster Standard Podcast. I'm Ryan Beasy. Today, I am joined by Dr. Michael Lynch and Teaching Elder James Baird. Welcome, brothers. We're going to talk about the American revisions to the Westminster Confession of Faith. Thanks for being on the program.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Well, we appreciate it when our OPC brothers come on. I just want to say, for the record, we appreciate the relationship. We cherish the relationship we have with the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. With that, who are you? Mike, you've been on, it was like a year and a half ago. We had you on with T. David Gordon to talk about the role of the church and state. But why don't you remind people who you are and where you're serving in New Jersey and at Davenant?
Yeah, I think you meant Delaware, and I'm a teacher at Delaware Valley Classical School here in Northern Delaware. That's my day job, and then I teach part-time at the Davenant Institute and, work for other places occasionally here and there. So that's what I do.
So professor, teacher, doctor. And James Baird, you're in Little Ohio down there in Florida.
Yeah, that's right. I am one of the pastors at Covenant Church of Naples in Naples, Florida, PCA. Been here for a few years, came on staff about a year ago. Yeah, that's me.
Wonderful. And so there's an ongoing debate. I don't know if it's quite a scandal, but some people say Ohio doesn't exist. What are your thoughts on that? A lot of expatriates who claim to be from Ohio there in Naples, Florida. Can you shed any insight into this great mystery as to the existence or not of Ohio?
Wait, hold on. What is an Ohio?
I don't know, but some people say they're from Ohio. I don't know. What is it?
Okay. Well, yeah, maybe James can tell us.
I've never heard of an Ohio, but I've heard of the Ohio. I'm still not sure it exists, but I think the more important question is, should it?
Should it exist?
Yeah.
So today we want to talk about the American revisions to the Westminster Standards, and the existence or not of Ohio, I suppose, doesn't have great bearing on that. So Dr. Lynch, maybe you can give us just a brief survey for those who may not realize, where did the Westminster Confession of Faith come from? We, as officers in the PCA and in the OPC, for sure, have to affirm that the Westminster Confession of Faith and its catechisms are our own confession of faith. Where did it come from?
Yeah, so it's a byproduct of religious and political controversies that were going on under Charles I. I mean, these controversies go all the way back into the 16th century as well, but Charles I is the monarch in England previous to the English Civil War that begins around 1641. I said it's religious and political. On the religious side of things, Charles is insisting, particularly in Scotland as well as in England, but the reason that the Civil War happens is because of his relationship in Scotland. He was trying to force kind of Laudian Episcopalianism on the Scotch ministers, and they were having none of it. And so he was trying to wage war against them.
And so when you say Laudianism, what do you mean there?
Yeah, Laudianism, for simplistic purposes, we'll just say kind of a high church Anglicanism that allows for some of the what we would call Roman Catholic kind of liturgical elements.
So like an Advent wreath, candles, vestments.
Well, no, I don't think that was what in particular people were getting upset about. Like having to kneel at the host, make the sign of the cross at certain places in the liturgy. And also there's kind of an incipient Arminianism that is often kind of tied to Laudianism, which some of the more Calvinistic, both Episcopalians and nonconformists, whether Presbyterian, Congregationalists, or independent, don't dislike about those theologians. So anyways, all that to say is that Charles is taking the side of the Laudians and trying to kind of push Laudianism into Scotland. Well, Parliament is largely made up of kind of Laudian elements in the Church of England who are more nonconformist with regard to some of the Laudian principles.
Some more low church, simple, what we might today call ordinary means of grace.
So Parliament would have been made up of. So we often think that the Church of England at this time is the Church of England that we see today, whether in England today or in America. But as Anthony Milton's work has kind of proved, previous to 1662, there was really a internal battle on what the Church of England was going to look like still. That was ongoing. Hence, most of the what we call nonconformists, whether Presbyterian or independents or Congregationalists that were at the Westminster Assembly, they were actually part of the Church of England. They were ministers in the Church of England, not outside of it, right, at the time that the Westminster Assembly began. So anyways, this can get overcomplicated, but the point I'm trying to make is that you have a battle over what the Church of England's going to look like, whether you want it to be more reformed or you like the status quo, or you might even want it in the more kind of Laudian direction, which is kind of to look closer like Roman Catholicism without a pope. And these are the different, that's kind of the scale,
the context. Okay.
Of that. There's also a political debate that's happening at the same time with regard to powers of Parliament relative to the monarch, right? And so when Parliament wages war against King Charles and those following him, it is a war that's not just religious, but it's also political. And those two are kind of mixed together. So the Westminster Assembly is called in, I think, I want to say 1643, 1642, 1643. I mean, there's a question of when they send out the letters to invite people and then when they actually come and start doing their sessions. But at the end of the day, 1642, 1643, the Westminster Assembly begins its work. Initially, they're tasked with revising the 39 Articles and the Book of Common Prayer. But they start doing that, and they realize, and Parliament realizes, together with the divines that they've invited, that this isn't really tenable for a variety of reasons, and so they just decide we're gonna write our own thing, a new confession, and that's where you get the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Sometimes it's easier to do that rather than try to fix something,
Yeah.
I started looking over my sermon on Saturday night and like, you know what? Let's just throw this thing out and start over, right?
Well, and part of the reason with regard to fixing the 39 Articles, I think it wasn't so much that they disagreed with a lot of it, was that there were lots of things they wanted to say. Now, given the, like almost, 75 years since the 39 Articles had been written, there were more controversies that they wanted to confess about or in response to that the 39 Articles really didn't treat. That's why the Westminster Confession of Faith is a way larger document than the 39 Articles, right? Because it's dealing with all sorts of other topics that the 39 Articles might spend a sentence on or not even comment upon, that the Westminster Divines wanted to have a confession about. They were taking seriously the Solemn League and Covenant, which was this document between Parliament and Scotland, that people took basically this oath that they would reform the Church of England, and so they're taking seriously that Solemn League and Covenant that they made.
I see. And just to be clear, it was the Parliament that summoned the Assembly, that convened the Parliament of England, that convened the Assembly.
Yeah. So
and paid,
in
right?
the 16th and 17th century, magistrates have the right to call them. It doesn't necessarily mean for all Reformed theologians in the period that a government has to, but the civil magistrate generally has the right to say, no, you can't meet, if the civil magistrate says no to it. And they also have the right to say you must meet about a particular theological topic or whatever if the magistrate insists upon it. Yes.
And, that sounds maybe controversial, and we may talk more about that and the changes that the Americans made. But, I think that if the mayor of Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, where I'm sitting, had asked all of the ministers or invited all of the ministers in Fort Oglethorpe to come and we're going to try to address this issue, that might not be called a synod, but it would certainly be analogous. And I think many ministers would show up and may produce a document. Show up.
And presumably, I just want to take that one step further. Presumably, the magistrate would be wanting the decision to lie in the hands of the clergy rather than him be kind of moving.
This is what I want you to say.
Yeah, exactly. So anyways, all that to say is that, that would be a function of the magistrate taking care over religion to some degree or another in his city, in this instance, or otherwise.
And we, and James, as we get into your article that you wrote for the American Reformer, maybe you can touch on, what I if I went to that, would I have to state a difference with our current American Westminster Confession of Faith? But before we move the historical context from the 17th century, Mike, I've heard that the Westminster Standards have been described as a consensus document. There are many areas where multiple different views can affirm the same statement. Would you agree with that the Westminster Standards are sort of the middle road of Reformed Protestantism?
Middle road is not the way I would describe it. I would describe it as a consensus document. They weren't usually interested in having a pan-Protestant
Sure.
document or even pan-Reform document. They were wanting a document that would satisfy all the different factions within the Church of England that we might easily call Reformed, very broadly. Right? So I've already mentioned that there were Congregationalists, Independents, Presbyterians, both of the English and Scottish variety, although the Scottish weren't delegates per se, but they were like commissioners, I think is what they're called, or something like that. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a consensus document. You could just point to something so kind of non-important as, say, the mode of baptism. If you go to the section on the mode of baptism, they basically say
it's rightly administered by sprinkling or pouring. Dipping the person into the water is not necessary.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason for that is precisely because there were those that preferred pouring or dipping as opposed to sprinkling. So, I mean, and by the way, that didn't cut necessarily across Presbyterian or Independent or Congregationalist lines. Many of these debates didn't cut across church polity lines. Oftentimes they cut across ministerial friendship lines. In other words, if your teacher or if your ministerial friend was of this ilk, then you probably tend towards that way. And if your ministerial groupings tended in another direction, then you usually went in another way. So yeah, I mean, it's a consensus document. All confessions are this way, by the way.
Yeah.
There's no confession that is not a consensus of the people that are writing it, right? Because there will be some diversity, and so they have to find where they agree. And the confession is basically a what they can agree upon sort of document.
Okay.
At least broadly, and then there's the question of whether or not, I'm pretty convinced that there's certain points where certain of the members would have disagreed on, and that gets into the question of how exactly would confessing the document actually work. And I think it was designed to be a public confession. In other words, basically they were saying, we are going to say this is what the Church of England teaches, and you're basically not allowed to teach against it. You might hold various opinions. You might think that this wording is no good, or you might think this one proposition is false, but you're not allowed to teach against it. I suspect that that's the way it is, but we actually don't know, even though there have been people that have wanted to. Like if you read Mitchell and Struthers on this, they tried to figure out exactly what confessing, how this was supposed to operate, and they just don't know. They don't know.
Because the only church or kirk to adopt the Westminster Standards was the Kirk of Scotland. So that may be a great transition point to when these were adopted by the kirk. How much room was there intended, at least originally, for guys with differences to the standards? I know in the
I don't know. So did you have to ex animo hold to every proposition in it? Or was it simply a matter of when they're examining you, they see that you kind of hold within the system, they held to some sort of system, but you can't teach any proposition against the confession. I don't exactly know how the Scots did it, but I do know that I believe you had to, with the 39 articles, you had to hold them ex animo. You had to hold every proposition as being true personally, not just teach against it. But the difference between, again, the Westminster Confession of Faith and the 39 articles is how much more is in the Westminster Confession of Faith, right? So it's a much easier to hold ex animo the 39 articles than it would be to hold ex animo every single proposition in the Westminster Confession of Faith. And so I don't exactly know. I tend to think this is just my own belief, that it is pretty impossible to try to find a human being that thinks that every single proposition, all the wording is such that they just have no qualms, no problems, no I'd rather say it this way or otherwise. 39 articles is easier. Obviously the Apostles' Creed would be super easy relatively. I mean, I don't think anyone in your congregation gets up on Sunday morning and is like, yeah, I'm not sure about that, except for maybe, like the
Descended into hell.
Something, right? So
yeah. And I think we talked about in seminary that even Chuck Hodge, our old friend, couldn't find, what was it, 6 men or a dozen men who affirms every single proposition, and that was in a better age, right?
Yeah.
Well, I want to ask the both of you something, and this is, I think, a great way to dive into, James, your article. But this is from the Adopting Act by the Kirk, where they said, I'm trying to pull it up there. My production team has the day off again. I think they are off more than they're on. But it is further declared that the Assembly understands some parts of that second article of Chapter 31 only of Kirks not yet settled or constituted in point of government, and that although in such Kirks, a synod of ministers and other fit persons may be called by the magistrate's authority nomination without any other call to consult and advise about matters of religion. There seemed to be some understanding by the Scots that when a church is in flux, that's when the magistrate might call a synod. But when a church is settled, such as the Church of Scotland, unlike those English who don't have their act together, they don't need the magistrate to call. Have you interacted with this statement in the Adopting Act, or the Act of Adoption by the Assembly?
I have not.
All right. Well,
but I do know what's going on here, right? So this is a division between the Scottish Presbyterians and basically all the Englishmen. So what the Scottish Presbyterians were more scared of anything that smelled of Erastianism. Now, Erastianism is a very tricky term to define in the early modern period. I think that it's best defined as as arguing that the magistrate has the right to meddle or take up the keys of the kingdom or do some sort of preaching or something like this. So basically either to do church discipline or preach in any sort of way. And by the way, you can see this opinion, this anti-Erastianism is Gillespie is the guy, right? If you just go read Gillespie's works, it's all over Gillespie.
Aaron's Rod Blossoming and so forth.
Yes, that one. And then his propositions, his 111 propositions or whatever it is. Yeah, exactly. The English, basically, they also were largely anti-Erastian if we define it in the narrow way that I mentioned it here. But what was unique about the Scottish Presbyterians as opposed to the Reformed in England was that they wanted the magistrate to merely enforce what the church decides rather than intermeddling in any way on how they decide it or what they decide with regard to religion. And so this is one of these weird things. Like the English Presbyterians just did not have this sort of tendency. Neither did the Congregationalists, in fact. Neither did the Independents like Philip Nye. It's really strange reading Philip Nye, who's an independent, who's arguing for more magisterial power with regard to religion than, say, Gillespie, who's a Presbyterian. So yeah. So anyways, these typically these divisions don't cut along lines, but they do cut across national lines. That is, all Scottish Presbyterians would agree with that. But I'm not convinced that most of the English Presbyterians or Independents or Congregationalists would. So
It is interesting how the culture impacts the views. Well, James, you have written this wonderful article in the American Reformer. We're very thankful for the work that the American Reformer does in highlighting confessional Protestantism historically. And so you're highlighting the differences between the Westminster Standards as adopted by the Americans in 1788 versus the original Assembly. Why did the Americans revise those standards in 1788?
Well, that really is kind of the billion-dollar question. To my knowledge, unless you guys know about something I don't know, we don't really have a whole lot of there has been a Van Dixhoorn, right, of the 1788 revisions, right? We don't have all the minutes and papers to know exactly what's going on there. I think that probably the best. Now we do have a ton of information around that period of time because of course it's the founding generation of America. People were writing like crazy. The printing presses were like always hot. We got tons of sermons. We have a very good sense. I think I heard someone say that if you just picked one figure from that period and tried to really seriously study everything they wrote, it would take 2 lifetimes. Like they're writing so much stuff. So we have a lot of information about that period of time, which provides context to what the Presbyterians might have been thinking. And it's important also, I think, as Americans that we've inherited a lot of concepts that are hugely important to how we just process our own small c constitution, like in our national identity. We've inherited a lot of the language from the founding generation, but we don't always mean the same things that they mean. So it's really, really easy and oftentimes super tricky to go back and read these documents because you'll read a phrase and you'll think, I know exactly what that means. I learned that in 8th grade, right? And no, actually, we don't.
You don't know what you're talking about, right?
Yeah. So the most important thing I think is understanding kind of the issues of the day, the culture of the day, the highly religious nature of these political conversations, and using that to interpret what happens in 1788. Now, I think probably one of the most important documents that we do have to help us understand what's going on in 1788 is actually a description of when the Synod of Philadelphia met in 1729 to adopt the confession. And so what they say, you mind if I jump to that?
Please.
All right. So what they say, and this is 60, 59 years earlier. The Synod
I was told there would be no math.
Yeah, that's as close you're going to get from me. So they adopt the confession with this qualification. They say we adopt the confession, accepting only some clauses in the 20 and 23rd chapters, concerning which clauses the Synod does unanimously declare that they do not receive those articles in any such sense as to suppose, 1, the civil magistrate hath a controlling power over synods with respect to the exercise of their ministerial authority. 2, or power to persecute any for their religion. And then 3, in any sense contrary to the Protestant succession to the throne of Great Britain. So these are 3. There's 3 ways you could potentially interpret clauses in chapter 23 and chapter 20 that they want to say they're adopting both of those chapters, right? But what they're saying is, but when we adopt them, we're not adopting them in these particular senses. And I think that if we dig pretty deep into what 3 things they're actually saying there, you get a pretty good idea of why the Americans 60 years later thought, well, now when we're adopting it at a assembly level, not just the Philadelphia Synod, but the assembly level, we want to actually make clear these 2 chapters to try and make sure people don't misinterpret them along lines that we were worried about previously. I think
that's pretty insightful.
Yeah, and we could go into those 3 reasons. I know Michael has thoughts about those as well. But what do you want to do, Ryan?
Yeah, I would love to hear those 3 reasons.
So, go ahead.
I wonder, it's just 60 years. So were there any really young guys in 29 who were really old in 88 that were there at both synods or both assemblies?
I don't know. Do you know, Mike?
No, I do not know.
I'm sure if there was, somebody would have written a PhD on it.
But it is no surprise that those are the two main chapters, along with a couple other things, that get revised. So you can tell that you can tell at minimum that the uncomfortableness about the language that you get that they're clearly showing in 1729 is it makes its way full-fledged in 1788, and so. Yeah, and my position on this is that the first thing that they don't want is Erastianism, right? So they want anything that smells, and this is the Scottish. So we even saw that. I think you could even see that in the Adoption Act of 1647, how the Scotch Presbyterians, how they were interpreting the confession, right? So they know that this is like a consensus document, but they do not want any sort of, they do not want the magistrate doing any ministerial work with regard to synods whatsoever, right? And so they're still worried about that. They're still worried that the magistrate is going to involve himself in synods in some way. And so they want to say, no, he should not be doing that, right? This is those sorts of meetings are ecclesiastical, they're not civil, and they need to be dealt with at the by clergy, not by magistrates of any kind. The second one about the not persecuting of their religion, it is very clear, and James's article gives abundant testimony to this, that when they talk about the persecuting of their religion, you could put into in between their religion, you could say their Protestant religion, and what they're really concerned with is any the magistrate persecuting certain denominations and preferring other ones. So in this is the fear that Presbyterians had the moment they got over here, was that Episcopalians in particular would have some sort of established Episcopalianism that would create the same problems that they were running away from to get to America, right? What they perceived was kind of a pan-Protestant uniformity, right? So we can all agree on what everyone agrees on if you're just called a Protestant, but we don't want the magistrate intermeddling between Calvinism and Arminianism or various church polity questions. But yeah, sure. I mean, we definitely don't want Roman Catholics. They would be okay with laws against Roman Catholics or Jews or Muslims. But of course, they didn't really need to have a lot of laws about that, because America at this time is not filled with a whole bunch of Roman Catholics, Jews, or
Mohammedans.
Muslims.
Yeah, that's what Maryland is for.
Yeah, so they're just interested in religious, basically what we would call as modern religious liberty for Protestants.
No, that makes that seems very reasonable. And if you don't like it, there's Maryland for you, and
yeah,
that's why they have so many problems there.
Then I would say the last reason that they give there, I think, is probably the most interesting, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I've seen some people try to interpret this and actually miss what they're saying. So it's a double negative. That's why it's hard, right? So they're saying that they're adopting chapter 20 and 23, right? But they do not receive them in any sense contrary to the Protestant succession to the throne of Great Britain. Right. So what's going on here? Well, basically, 1715, Great Britain decided Catholics are horrible because they had been. And they create basically that if you're going to sit on the throne of Great Britain, you have to be Protestant. And the Americans like this in 1729. They like it. And they say they're actually worried someone would interpret chapters 20 and 23 in such a way that wouldn't allow there to be a Protestant on the throne of Great Britain. Right? They're worried that it would support a Catholic monarch. Yeah. And so what they're saying here is, we do not adopt these two chapters in any sense contrary to the Protestant succession to the throne of Great Britain. And I think that all three of these statements are actually interlocked, right? Because what happens in 1715 is that they want a Protestant succession to the throne of Great Britain, so the Catholics don't basically persecute and kill the Protestants. And in the previous clause to this, right, it's saying that they don't adopt it in any sense in which the magistrate can persecute someone for their religion. And so therefore, right, because it's almost an implication, therefore we think it would be great to have a Protestant on the throne of Great Britain to ensure that the Catholics don't persecute us anymore. And one I think central piece is that when they say persecute anyone for their religion, you need to realize in the historical context they're not saying persecute anyone who believes any of the one world religions. What they mean is persecute anyone for their true Christian faith and practice, and really Protestant.
Right.
Not persecute anyone for their
They were
Protestant
not
religion.
pluralists.
They weren't pluralists. They
No.
believed in toleration, just different degrees during different times and circumstances, but not pluralists.
By the way, there is commentary that we have on that phrase about persecuting their religion. So, who's the guy? Who's the guy that was
Craighead? Craighead?
No,
Craighead?
the other guy.
Blair.
Blair. Yeah, Blair, who was a minister, a colonial Presbyterian minister at the time, he says Craighead and Blair are at odds with each other on the Adopting Act, and they write this back and forth about it, and they treat this particular phrase in the Adopting Act about persecuting their religion. And Blair, who's in support of the Adopting Act of 1729, says that that they only have in mind basically the magistrate should not be, just because you call yourself say a Methodist, that is not enough for there to be any persecution. You cannot persecute on the basis of merely someone saying, I'm a this or I'm a that in terms of denominations. But he does say that they're okay with persecuting the promulgation of error and heresy.
Yep.
Right? So it's
American
not even
Presbyterian.
clear. Yeah, it's not even clear to me that they're against, like, say a Methodist were arguing something that the magistrate thought was in print, arguing something that was he thought against religion in some way, against the Protestant religion, that he could say, no, you're not to publish this. Now,
such as things a Methodist might argue for today.
Yeah, exactly. That's very true. Now, I do think by 1788, given how they rewrite the confession, I think they're probably saying we don't want the magistrate doing that either. But that may be one of these kind of shifts in kind of views on what exactly they have in mind with regard to persecution. It seems by 1788 they do not want any denomination persecuted, even any Protestant denominational clergyman to be persecuted simply for arguing his own kind of traditional Protestant position, whatever that may be.
I think that's probably a good transition, because there's two questions here. And I think all this historical context just helps create like a plausibility structure to do the sort of interpretive work I do in these two articles that I wrote, where basically you got to realize they're not pluralists, they're not classical liberals, right? They're Reformed Christians who believe that the magistrate has the care of religion in some way or another. And they're trying to, I think, adopt it, maybe adjust slightly to kind of some of the sentiments that they have for this vision of a pan-Protestant America. And I think that, okay, let's like set down a few core principles. Like, what do these guys believe? Like, what is your normal Presbyterian guy in America, mid to late 1700s? What does he believe? Well, they get a sense that they want America to be like a Protestant place. You can see this is super clear by just looking at religious tests for offices, right? And America had historically and was just descriptively a Protestant place. And they believed that the various magistrates had the right to run it as a Protestant place, which is one reason why in places like New Jersey, and other states, including my home state of Georgia, you couldn't hold office unless you were Protestant. That didn't mean you couldn't live there. They tolerated Catholics and Jews, if there were any in Georgia at the time. But it was run by Protestants because it was a Protestant place. And they had Protestant religious laws, the blasphemy laws, Sabbath laws. You would even have the Continental Congress declaring days of national, prayer and fasting, Thanksgiving. So this is a Protestant place. They want it to stay a Protestant place, and they want to run it like a Protestant place.
And you cite in your article as late as 1941, blasphemy convictions being upheld into the 20th century.
Can I add to that?
Yep.
I am reading from an actual law that is on the books in Massachusetts. Quote, today, like literally today, you could go to a prosecutor and try to, good luck trying to get the state of Massachusetts to prosecute on this law, but it is on the books. Quote, whoever willfully blasphemes the holy name of God by denying, cursing, or contumeliously reproaching God, his creation, government, or final judging of the world, or by cursing or contumeliously reproaching, I don't know how to say that word, conscientiously, anyways, reproaching Jesus Christ or the Holy Ghost, or by cursing or contumaciously, yeah, sure.
We should move on.
Or exposing to contempt and ridicule. That is not an adverb that I use ever. Anyway, the holy word of God contained in the Holy Scripture shall be punished by imprisonment in jail for not more than 1 year, or by a fine of not more than $300, or may be also bound to good behavior. That's a law that is on the books right now in Massachusetts.
And make no mistake, that is enforcing with the power of the civil magistrate, power of the sword, the first table of the law.
Yeah.
And this is what Americans believed. That first, of course, you enforce the first table of the law, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you go and you burn at the stake anyone who stubbed their toe in the middle of the night, right? But it meant people who are doing something that harmed the public welfare of the people by doing something like saying nasty things about Jesus and his mom in a public tavern, which is what happens with People versus Rubles and the New York case, where they ruled that the state does have a right to prosecute and punish blasphemers because it strikes at the heart of religion and public morality. And this is, after the founding by a couple decades. So this is what everybody in America believes. So when we come to the American version of the Westminster Confession, and we start reading a lot of these phrases with language that we learned in middle school, high school, or college, and they sound similar, we may think that what they're teaching is something similar to classical liberalism, pluralism, right? But when you look at the context of the day, it just simply can't mean that. Unless you want to suppose that the assembly that gets together, and they adopt it in 1789, is actually critiquing pretty much the whole constitutional order of the United States of America, which is simply absurd, like right after the revolution. They're not doing that. They're good Americans, and their heritage, their forefathers were the ones who, particularly in the Northeast, had founded and created this culture.
And quite frankly, they're the ones who are running the country at this point.
They're running the country at this point. I mean, for example, John Witherspoon, right? He's at the Provincial Congress of New Jersey that actually creates the new state constitution of New Jersey, and was one of the ones I don't have his voting records, but he was one of the ones there. And what they passed was a law that said civil rights are only guaranteed to Protestants. They would tolerate others, but civil rights are only guaranteed to Protestants. So it's just not plausible to think that they're teaching classical liberalism or pluralism at the time. So that is all the background that we can then actually do like an exegesis of the differences between 20 and 23. Because I think that for the PCA and ecclesiastically, the question is, there's a kind of a theological question and then an ecclesiastical question. So the theological questions are these two contradictory theologies of the civil magistrate as the doctrine, as the propositions run? in the two sections. As the propositions run in the two sections, are they contradictory takes on the civil magistrate? Is there any part of the American version of 23 that if you believe that, you have to deny a part of the original version of 23? The implication of that for people in the PCA or any Presbyterian denomination that takes subscription seriously is, if you believe the original version, do you have to take an exception?
You don't take an exception. You're granted an exception. You bring all of your wrong views to the court or anywhere that you think you might differ, and the court decides we're going to give you an exception there, or we're going to tell you to go to the EPC or the ECO or the RCA because the weather's lovely in the RCA this time of year. So you don't take an exception.
Humbly request an exception.
That's right.
State a difference.
Yes.
All right. That's my setup.
So, and that's an important question because there are a lot of things that they took out, and what I had always understood up until the recent debates about Christian nationalism or theonomy rebranded or whatever it's called now, those Baptist errors that are creeping into the PCA. Mm-hmm. But they took out the statement about the Bishop of Rome being the Antichrist. Well, that doesn't mean that they denied that the Bishop of Rome was the Antichrist. Correct. It simply meant that they are not having that as a part of their confessional standards, that our ministers must all confess this. I don't have to state a difference for my presbytery because I don't have a difference.
That's right.
It's silent on that point.
That's right. I feel like this is really, really hard for lots of people, including myself, to wrap your head around. And then once you get it, it clicks.
Yeah.
It's very simple. However much it may change a confession, removing something is not the same as denying it. In a confessional context, right? So previously, to be a minister, you had to affirm something. And by removing it, you're no longer requiring them to affirm it, but you are not requiring them to deny it. So the first thing you got to look at when you look at the revisions is everything they took out, right? And unless they take something out and then add a denial of what they took out, then you can still believe what they took out. It's optional. It's perfectly fine. That framework, I think, is really, and then you can start looking at what they added, secondly, to look for an actual denial. But the first step is just to realize that, yeah, you don't have to deny stuff that's not addressed by the confession.
So when they say the magistrate may not in the least interfere in matters of faith, what are they saying there? Because it would seem like to blaspheme would be a matter of faith. And if the magistrate is punishing someone with 364 days in jail and a $270 fine, that seems to be interfering with somebody's faith. So can you square that circle for me? Why don't you?
I think, that's great. I think that when you're thinking about the American context, the helpful way to reason is to look at what they were okay with in the day and then reverse engineer the answer, right? So
you're saying that words have meaning.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Oh boy, we got one of those non-postmodernists here.
Yeah, it's gonna be rough. Bad day for you, Ryan.
I know. Well, it depends on how you define bad, I guess.
Yeah. So basically, right, we can say, well, everyone was okay with blasphemy laws during the time, and we even have different things like John Witherspoon, very important, super important elder at the assembly. He says blasphemy laws, good to go. So they're okay with blasphemy laws. So it can't mean that. And then if you look at, you could call it a reform scholastic distinction, but I mean, this distinction goes back, I don't even know how long when it first starts. But there's a classic distinction between the authority of the magistrate around or about religion or sacred things, and the authority of the magistrate in sacred things. So it's in sacra versus circa.
Let me pull up that quote from your essay. Sorry. Yeah. Again, that production team, not the sharpest, and they're off today.
You need to take a Patreon up.
I should get but then I'm gonna have to pay my production team, and they're not worth paying.
So Turretin's always kind of a safe place to go, and you even see this in Turretin. If you look in the English, it's not as clear, but he's clearly utilizing these Latin terms where he talks about magistrate does have authority circa sacra, basically about sacred things or around sacred things. And the way I like to put this is that the magistrate has a duty to ensure that in his realm, true religion flourishes and is not molested by anything. It is, the best example probably is thinking about like the role of the father in the home, right? So before I was ordained, I could not give my wife communion, right? I didn't have authority in sacra. I didn't have ecclesiastical authority, right? I did have a duty and responsibility and the authority to ensure my whole family went to church on Sunday, right? And that we were prepared the night before the Lord's Day, so that we could have, a restful Sabbath dedicated to worship and service. And so I have an authority around sacred things. I'm creating a context where my family can enjoy the things of God, even though I don't actually have direct ecclesiastical authority to preach the word to them on a Sunday morning. And it's very similar with the magistrate. The magistrate has to create conditions within society where true religion can flourish. And that's what Turretin and the Reformed tradition has in mind. And really the Christian tradition, although the critique is always, well, you say you're using that distinction, but not really, right? But there was this idea going really all the way back to at least to Constantine, right, where there is a care of religion that the magistrate has that is bounded by the fact that he's in charge of the temporal realm, not the spiritual or eternal realm. So when the Americans say that he cannot interfere in matters of faith, the Americans in 1788 aren't saying anything that the Westminster Divines would have denied. This is not them critiquing the original version of the confession. This is them doing what they said they wanted to do in 1729, which is clarifying the sense in which these articles should be received. They're clarifying it. They're not denying it or critiquing it or proposing like a contradictory or contrary theology. Does that sound right?
And one of the ways we see that, I think, is with the larger catechism. And I think you point this out in your second article.
Yep.
What's the difference article with larger catechism 191. And whenever I am examined by a church court, I state what I understand this to mean. And then they determine whether that's a difference or is it just a semantic scruple. But when we pray the second petition, thy kingdom come, that the church will be countenanced and maintained by the civil magistrate. And you note on that point, you want to read your own words there.
What did I say?
One may wonder whether the American...
Yeah. Basically, it's this big question of like, did they just forget and accidentally not change the larger catechism? Because you have 191, and you also have their exposition of the duty of superiors from the Fifth Commandment, where they say that basically civil magistrates are one of the authorities styled as a father or mother, has a duty to provide all things necessary for the soul. So there's these sections in the larger catechism, and the question is, did they just forget?
Which doesn't seem likely to me, because at this time, my presumption is most ministers would have the larger catechism memorized. Because the larger catechism was for the training of ministers. Nowadays, ministers may memorize the shorter catechism 2 or 3 times and then forget it 3 or 4 times. But
we're worse off than their children in a lot of ways. The answer is just like no, and not only for the reasons you just mentioned. First of all, for the reasons you mentioned. Second of all, like these guys may have had fewer texts available than we did, but the texts that they had were better, and they knew them 100 times better than we did. So
they didn't have Logos or any of those. You can't just search your whole library.
So they knew their core texts inside and out. But then the third reason is we just see them saying stuff like this in other places, like all the time. They want the magistrate. I use the example of the state constitution of Massachusetts. You also see this in New Hampshire, and you can find other examples, other places as well, because it's pretty common, although there's some debate over it. And in fact, the statement I'm about to say is still in the Constitution of Massachusetts, which makes sure that funds can be procured so that there are Protestant churches and Protestant schools. And that is the state constitution of Massachusetts countenancing and ensuring that the church is financially maintained by the civil magistrate. Now, some people may worry about that. You can think of better or worse ways to do that. But think about this, like very simple example, right? You're moving out west, you're on the frontier, you got a little podunk town, and you're the mayor or the sheriff, and you're like, we don't have a place to worship. We don't have a place to worship. But we got a surplus from last tax season, and we're going to build a church because I want our people to have a place where they can worship. That is part of the behavior that the confession is saying. When you say thy kingdom come, that's what you're praying for. That the civil magistrate does his duty and ensures that all the people under his care have everything they need for their souls. So they believed it.
So it wasn't just, oops, we forgot to change the law to catechism. It was, we don't have a problem with that, is your argument, which seems consistent with what you've said so far. We always appreciate consistency. So what does the American Westminster Confession of Faith require the magistrate to do? It is the duty of civil magistrates to protect the person and good name of all their people in such an effectual manner that no person be suffered either upon pretense of religion or of infidelity to offer any indignity, violence, abuse, or injury to any other person whatsoever. So that doesn't prohibit the original standards, as you've said.
Again, for this time period, the best thing to do is to look at other things they say about the duty of the civil magistrate and then reverse engineer what they must have meant by this phrase. That's I think the best way to kind of hone in on the possible interpretation. And because when you first read this and you hear language like this today, again, you think, oh, this is like pluralism, classical liberalism. No one should be disadvantaged or disfavored, much less, given abuse or injury for their religious beliefs. But then you actually start like breaking down this sentence and what no person means. So who is not allowed to, for example, cause another person injury based on their religion or infidelity? What is the no person there? It could mean, first of all, absolutely no person whatsoever, no matter their office or station. Right. The problem is that would make church discipline illegal. Because what is church discipline but basically giving someone the greatest possible indignity of no longer associating with the body of Christ? And what worse injury can there be than turning someone over to Satan? So if this means absolutely no person, no matter their office or station, it would make church discipline illegal. And we basically say,
of course they didn't mean that.
Yeah, of course they didn't mean that, right? So then you would say, well, maybe they mean like just civil magistrates, right? Maybe it's just the civil magistrate is the one who can't cause, indignity or injury. And that just doesn't make pretty much any sense at all.
Those blasphemy laws would undermine that.
Yep. Sabbath laws, blasphemy laws, the religious test for office, right? That's a great indignity not to be able to hold public office because of your religious belief. So then the third option, which is just, I think, pretty certain this is what they meant when you look at the early American context, is they're saying like you can't be a religious vigilante. The magistrate cannot allow private individuals to go around and hurt other people or hurt, destroy their property or persecute them because of their supposed religion, right? So if you hear, John Brown down the block is a Catholic, you can't just go and rob him, right? The magistrate must ensure good order and justice. And, at the time they'd be like, maybe we should fine John Brown for being a Catholic, but the magistrate must do it according to a wholesome law.
Well, it's our duties according to our several places and relations, right?
Right. That's right.
So that's all they're reflecting here.
Yeah.
It seems also in this text that they're saying two different things. One, no person should be allowed to do certain things like offer any indignity, violence, abuse, or injury on account of religion to any other person. So what they don't want here, it seems to me, is you are not allowed to like personal attacks on the basis of I'm a Presbyterian and you're a Methodist, and so I'm going to start calling you an ungodly, impious, non-Christian. Like, it seems to me that what they're actually saying is it's the duty of magistrates to disallow that.
Yeah.
In other words,
Good
you
point.
want you can have debate. Debate
Yeah.
is fine,
Yeah.
right? Like debate over doctrine and stuff like that. Obviously, we know that they're doing all of that in print. But you're not allowed. There's a line that's crossed, and perhaps this is the line that you know it when you see it, sort of thing. But
An
at the
ad
end of the
hominem.
day, huh?
Ad hominem, perhaps, attacks would be.
Yeah, exactly.
Or slander.
Such that it is become abusive or indignant or violent. Probably means physical violence here. They probably don't have, but injury to one's good name. They probably mean both, either or, because we did have laws, and we still have laws against basically what are they called? The laws against malicious, false attacks on people. Anyways, I mean, we have that in our Constitution.
Libel?
Yeah, libel laws and these sorts of things. So you're not allowed to libel on the basis of religion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's not a. So, anyways, and then they go to the second one, which is right. Presbyterians can't go and stop the Methodists from worshiping.
Yep.
Right? You can't molest them.
That's
right? Indeed, we saw this just recently in Seattle, where the LGBTQ community like stopped a Christian organization meeting in a park. They'd been given a permit from doing some sort of
concert-y
park Christian thing. What happened was the civil magistrate actually came in and made the people that were meeting in the park, the Christians, stop, even though they had been given permission to do it. Right? No. The duty that they're saying here is that civil magistrate had a duty to keep the LGBTQ religion guys from keeping these other people from having their meeting.
Mm-hmm. And there's obviously two reasons why they add this clause. Again, it's simply not to restrict the power of the civil magistrate. In fact, it is telling the civil magistrate what he ought to use his coercive power to do.
Yes.
Right? But the two reasons they put in here, one, they had suffered, and had definitely descended from people who had suffered the disturbance of their assemblies, right, and violence. And if we're honest, the Americans got a little rowdy, and the Scottish had gotten a little rowdy, and people weren't sure what they thought about the Presbyterians. And this is, I think, a principle all Presbyterians would have definitely affirmed in principle. But they're basically making sure that they're protected, but that also it's very clear what they do and do not find acceptable. That's my reading. That's what I think. So in other words, in the original case of do not interfere in matters of faith, that is not contradicting the original confession. This is also not contradicting the original standards, because you could have derived all of these duties from the larger catechism on the Ten Commandments. Every single one of these duties stated here were already stated in the larger catechism, especially if you believe the civil magistrate has a duty basically to uphold the morals of the people, which they did believe. So nothing here is new. It is adapted to their particular context, but it does not deny the original confession. And I would say, me and I'd add Mike, this isn't our own interpretation, because you even have Samuel Blair, right, Presbyterian minister, who expressly says that when they in 1929 did not adopt chapter 20 and 23 in any of those three senses that we mentioned earlier, he said, and he strictly says, and on my part, I don't think that the original assembly intended those senses at all anyway. So at least Samuel Blair agrees that the American Presbyterians are trying to clarify something, not because they're changing what the original assembly intended, but because they don't want people to misinterpret what they meant. Wow. So now that's one guy, right? But we don't have a lot of other documentation. But this is at least not a novel way to read what happened in 1729 or what happened in 1788. And it's pretty consistent theologically.
So there have been arguments made that the change to the American version was a repudiation of the Westminster Standards, but you're quoting from contemporary sources from 1729 that said, well, I don't think they intended it that way anyway. And there was only an 80-year. I was told there'd be no math, but there's only an 80-year, 60 year,
59.
59. Well, I mean, from between 1647 and
You're right.
1729,
Right.
it was measured in decades, not centuries. Let's agree on that at least.
Yeah.
But between these two, now there was a continent between them. But you say to prove the American version contradicts the original version, proponents of the extreme view must look at a clause that one version affirms that the other denies. And what you're saying is there's no such clause that says, well, we did not mean this.
Yeah. Another way to put it is like if someone now I subscribe to the American version. I like the American version. But let's say that I didn't.
It's the greatest version of all because America
it's
the greatest ever. It's huge. It's big.
Yeah.
Winning.
It's one big confession.
Big, beautiful confession.
One big, beautiful confession. What was I saying? Okay.
I have no idea.
If someone came up to me and they were like, hey, do you agree with the original version? And I said, yeah. They said, you have to take an exception to the American version. I would say, which part? Like, show me which part I'm supposed to take an exception, or
state a difference,
state a difference, and humbly request an exception.
Show me which part of the American. Show me what the PCA confesses that I'm wrong about, because that's a difference. Is to say the PCA is wrong here. Okay, show me in the Constitution of the PCA where I disagree. Someone not that long ago was accusing me of promulgating a theological error, and show me in the Constitution where I am disagreeing. I'm not bound by what's written in a binder in a closet down in Lawrenceville for some committee. That doesn't bind me. The binder binds the committee maybe, but show me in the Constitution where I have a difference.
I have something I want to add. It seems also, as we read the American version, that what you have is what you would expect with taking Scottish Presbyterianism and transporting it into America.
Ooh, great point.
The first point about civil magistrates not meddling in synods and in ecclesiastical affairs is a particularly anti-Erastian thing that all the Scotch were always against. Right. And so that just continues. And of course, the Presbyterian Church in America at this time, not the PCA, but just the church in the Americas at the time was largely Scottish. Like I think it's something like 2/3. It's a majority at the time, right? Presbyterians at the time, I think, Scotch Irish at least. So that's the first thing to note. But then you might ask the question, why the pan Protestantism? Well, I think that's the uniquely American thing about it, right? In Scotland, they do not have this sentiment, right? That's because they have a Scottish established church, which is Presbyterian. So obviously, you can offer indignity towards you can persecute others because there's only one church and it's the Scottish.
Right. Everything else is just in theory, right? There are no Methodists that you can persecute.
Right. Yeah. Yes. But in America, they already recognize that is not going to work.
That's right.
You're not going to get this is not a Scottish Presbyterian America, right? And so what they're now looking at is, well, how can we protect or establish Protestantism? And we establish Protestantism by telling by saying that the magistrate should not prefer one denomination over another, but rather should just protect all of them. Right. This gets to James's soft establishmentarianism versus a kind of a stronger one that you would get, say, in England or Scotland at the time. So all that to say is that, and even then things were changing, right? I mean, we can't overestimate like 1688, the Glorious Revolution, and then the Act of Toleration and these sorts of things that were basically saying, we're going to treat you as second-class Protestants, basically. Right? You had to be a Protestant. You didn't get all the rights that a Church of England man got, but you were allowed as long as we gave you a license to kind of meet and do your thing as a Presbyterian or a Methodist or whatever else. So anyways, and then the final thing I think is not unique to America. It's not unique to Scotland, but is unique to Protestantism in general, Whatever the case is, we don't want a pope, or rather a popish magistrate.
Yeah.
In other words, we want a Protestant monarch, president, whatever.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so this is, I think, part of what you're arguing, your conclusion. The Presbyterians in Philadelphia envision an America defined not by a single national Presbyterian church, but rather by a pan-Protestantism, defended and upheld by its nursing father, which is confessed in the in the American version. Such a vision is not identical with the vision of the original confession, but neither is it strictly contradictory. And that's such an important nuance to see.
That's right. Yeah, this is the reason why I like the American version, right? It's very American. Like it would be hard to go back to the original version because it feels weird, right? Because it wasn't written by Americans, but the American revisions were. And so it's adjusted not in strictly contradictory ways, but you feel two different sentiments when you read the two different versions, right? And the American version is aimed at a pan-Protestantism, not this one federal Presbyterian church. So yeah,
and it's what always has happened throughout history, that the Americans have had to come in and clean up and fix what the Europeans, especially the British, have gotten almost correct. But we had to do that in 1917, had to do it in 1941, had to do it in 1788. I mean, it's just the American way, isn't it?
It's honest work.
That's right.
Honest work. The thing I wanted to add is that I think that we cannot underestimate what the Americans did not change. Some actually, if you're going to ask me which section of chapter 23 is the most, which should be the most startling to a modern person, it would be section 1 and 2. Section 1 and 2, I think, are vastly more startling, and they are, in other words, different from how we feel today. Or I'm just speaking like most Americans. Section 1 says that God establishes the magistrate for the public good. Now, of course, you got to say, like, hey, what is the public good? We don't talk like that anymore. During the time, they talked about it all the time. It was the whole point of government, was the general welfare of the people.
Public good is common good.
It's common good. Yeah.
Is how we talk about is the term that you get in some of the like Roman Catholic literature, especially today.
Yeah. It's a more classical language, but the confession says public good. So public good, but it's just a synonym. Now, that doesn't seem too crazy at first until you look at section 2. Because in section 2, they actually give you a definition of the public good. And if you read just like the Western legal tradition, you will oftentimes find a tripartite list just like this, where a political philosopher defines the public good. This is like super common. Oftentimes it would be like justice, peace, and abundance, or piety, justice, and well-being.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, exactly. So we get here the confession's definition of the public good, and it includes piety.
It begins with piety.
It begins with piety. And it means, if you look at section 1 and 2, it means 1, the civil magistrate was made for the sake of the piety of the people, public piety, right? You could say. And look at section 1 again. So if you interpret the public good as meaning in part public piety, it says, and to this end. This is a purpose clause. So for the sake of public piety, God armed the magistrate with the power of the sword. So section 1 and 2, when read together, teach that the magistrate, is supposed to use his coercive power in order to promote and maintain the piety of the godliness of the religion of the people. Section 2 goes a step further. It says that, basically the magistrate, it says a Christian magistrate, you can have one, right? So they're not Anabaptists. It says the Christian magistrate ought especially, so notice the word especially means all magistrates should do this, but especially the Christian magistrate. And what is that duty? Maintain piety, justice, and peace according to the wholesome laws of each commonwealth. So for that end, they may lawfully now under the New Testament wage war. In other words, Section 2 says the magistrate may wage war for the sake of maintaining the public piety of the people. So Section 1 and 2, I think, are very startling when you realize what they're saying, because we tend to think the magistrate, oh man, you can punish, robbers, you can publish people who harm us materially, but you can't publish people for their religion or lack of religion. That's not what our church confesses.
And one could imagine that this might play out in what we kind of had warring against Canada when Canada, particularly
The John Candy movie?
No.
Canadian Bacon? What?
No, not Canadian Bacon nor John Candy movies. But when north of New York, right, Roman Catholicism was quite flourishing up in Canada, and there was big concern that might infect America in some way. So anyways, and this is one of the reasons why there was, as far as I remember, it's been a while since I read on some of the American Revolution sort of military history on all this, but I think one of the concerns was, on the one hand, we wanted to get the Canadians on our side, but on the other hand, they're Roman Catholics, and we didn't want to bring them in really to the American side because of the Roman Catholicism. So there was this desire to have them on our side against the British. But on the other hand, they were Roman Catholics, and we were concerned about their religion. Anyways, all that
which is why Benedict Arnold, right? That's the reason why he actually defected, right? Because he's worried that the Canadian Catholics would take over when the Americans lost.
Yeah. So, anyhow, I mean, all of these religious and political things are kind of mingling even during the revolution, and some of the principles that they're taking with regard to who we're going to ally with, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I want to add one quick qualification. Everything that I just said could seem extraordinarily extreme, and by modern standards, maybe it is, but there's a few qualifications that I do think help us understand what's going on here. So the Reformed, actually, and this even goes back to Thomas, when they say that the magistrate has a duty to use his coercive powers to maintain the piety of the people, he's not allowed. It would be wrong for him to go around and lock up every person who breaks one of the 10 Commandments. Right? First of all, everyone would be in jail. Second of all, his job is for public piety, right? He has a duty with basically what's going to impact the public good, right? So you can imagine someone, cursing alone at home, right? And then someone blaspheming in public, right? So they're talking about actually punishing things that are going to hurt the welfare of the people, not just simply going around and punishing everyone for every transgression of God's moral law. The second one is that, and you can look at this particularly with Althusius is super helpful. It is oftentimes very important for the magistrate to permit what he cannot prevent. So there may be some particularly bad thing that he actually has the jurisdiction to punish, but he realizes that all the people in this land love that thing so much that if I come down really hard, they'll rebel and overthrow me, and society will devolve into chaos, right?
That's the prohibition principle, right?
Yeah.
This is what prohibition. This is why it didn't work. Now, whether or not the ends were achieved for prohibition, which I think were actually largely achieved by prohibition, it wasn't that the state doesn't have the right to pass the laws that they did and the amendment that they did. The problem is they had no way of enforcing it, and what it actually did was it created this mass lawlessness in its wake, because they couldn't actually enforce it. They didn't have enough enforcement officers. They didn't have enough people on their side to actually enforce it. Had they done that, it would probably have worked out well. And even though I'm against prohibition on kind of other principles, right? The real reason why it was imprudent, rather than unlawful, was it was imprudent because they couldn't enforce it actually, and it actually created more unlawfulness, not unlawfulness in terms of more drinking. Actually, I believe drinking went down actually at Prohibition, like actual lot less drunkenness actually. However, it created it basically tempted a whole bunch of people who
Gangsters.
Yeah, well, not just the gangsters, but just people that wanted to drink and were doing it not even in a terrible way, to just go around the law, and it was too easy to do it.
Yeah.
When laws are too easily breakable, they probably shouldn't be there.
Like speed.
Well,
I mean, in Georgia, from what I've been told, they don't care if you are within 10 miles of the speed limit. And so then the speed limit, you drive through Atlanta, the speed limit is 55 miles an hour, but everybody is going at least 65 miles an hour. And you're getting right.
Yeah.
So,
but
have the speed limit, what traffic is actually going, and it'll be safer for everybody.
Yeah.
Because if I'm going through Atlanta going 55 miles an hour.
Yeah. You could argue that what's going on there is that they're doing it intentionally low, and then allowing a certain level of lawlessness. But if that lawlessness is too lawless, then they start to enforce it, right? So, if you're going 90 in a 55, you probably get pulled over. But if you're going 75, you probably aren't, at least around here. And that's just the way it goes. So there's something like a de jure de facto kind of, de jure it says 55, but de facto the law is like 70, right? Or something like that. Yeah. So anyways, laws are like this, right? They're rather pliable in their de facto enforcement.
That's right. And people also like to bring up sometimes when the debates over whether or not America was a Christian nation are, I think, pretty silly. I think it clearly was. But the counter examples people will bring up will be like, oh, but there are synagogues in this state that are older than a church. That does not disprove that America was a Christian nation, for the simple reason that Protestants did believe in the principle of toleration. They would tolerate some other religions, certain amounts. They weren't allowed kind of equal representation. You couldn't make, for example, there are laws that say no building in town can be bigger than the church, right? This is one reason why if you go to Princeton University, they still have this kind of rule. And so the library goes stories underground, right? Because it couldn't be taller than the chapel. So they would make these rules where they would allow some toleration, but they would still ensure that what gets promoted and put at center stage was Christianity, and Protestant Christianity very often. So don't envision, okay, here we go. Don't envision the magistrate all of a sudden being charged with prosecuting the type of things that a presbytery or a session would prosecute in church discipline, right? The magistrate must use prudence. In certain circumstances, it would be prudent for him to have toleration, and he must focus on public piety, not private piety. He's focused on the outward and the temporal. The church, given the keys of the kingdom of heaven, is in charge with the inward and the spiritual. And I think people get those mixed up and get worried about what the confession may be saying when they don't need to be. The model makes sense.
Right. So blasphemy could be punished in the church by excommunication or suspension from the Lord's Supper and these sorts of things. But blasphemy by the state would be fine or even thrown into prison for 3 months or something, depending on the all the aggravating factors, right? And so it's two different things. One is in accordance with civil law. One is in accordance with ecclesiastical law, right? And so they're even doing it on the basis of two different laws, even though both of those laws might have their genesis in divine law.
And so as we wrap up, and PCA General Assembly is just days away at this point, if it is convened, at this point, maybe we ought to just take a year off. But and one of the proposals is for either a study committee or a letter dealing with Christian nationalism and providing counsel. James, Mike, as you think about what do people need to understand about the church's confession regarding the role of the state, the role of the church, and the state that may be missed? If you could just summarize that in 2 or 3 sentences.
State your question one more time. I started thinking about the overtures.
It was a compound question, but what do people often miss? Just to summarize in 2 or 3 sentences about what the church, the PCA, and the OPC have confessed about the role of the church, the state, the church, and the state, the magistrate, regarding public piety.
I think one thing to keep in mind with the whole Christian nationalism study committees is that they're lumping a tons of things in there together, right? Some of those things may or may not need to be addressed. But we do need to focus on what our church currently confesses, right? Which is that it is the job of the civil magistrate to maintain the piety of the people, and he has been given his coercive powers by God to do just that. That's what it says. And that is, it also says that the civil magistrate is supposed to, he's duty bound by God to ensure all the people in his realm have what they need for their souls, and that he must countenance and maintain the church. We have to start. That is what our church confesses, and then we can deal with issues different pastors are worried about in other areas. But I would say stake your flag there. That's what our church confesses, and then work through some of these other hot topics as necessary.
And I would just add to to put it more negatively, is that what the confession is not teaching is that the magistrate is to be as neutral as possible with regard to religion. I mean, that's just simply not the position that the American founders held, the American Presbyterian founders held, nor is it stated in any way whatsoever in the confession. And so if you hold that position, I think that you need to state that as a difference. If you believe that the magistrate should have his hands off, if you take a libertarian view on the magistrate relative to religion, you are out of step with the confession, because the confession is giving a positive duty, and you are saying that he ought not to do that. So, anyways, that's my only thing.
He is the nursing father of the body of the Lord Jesus Christ, and anyone who's not the body of the Lord Jesus Christ is the enemy of his children, and he ought to treat them as such.
Well, that's a good place to end it. Thank you, James and Michael. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining the conversation on the Westminster Standard, which is the podcast of Jude 3. For more information or to support our work at promoting confessional renewal within the Presbyterian Church in America, please visit our website, jude3pca.org. Join us again next time. I'll talk to you then.